Hello, and welcome to the YouTube channel 3D Printing for Geoscientists. My name is Allie, and in this tutorial today, I'm going to teach you how to use the difference tool that will allow us to subtract one object from another to create both internal and external features. And we're also going to use the clipping plane to be able to have a better ability to visualize those features, especially the internal ones. And so I've already got FormZ pulled up on my desktop here. I've got my pick tool selected, and the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to make some basic shapes. Now you can learn more about this in our basic shape tutorial, but essentially right now I'm just going to make a tall cubic rectangle, and I'm not worried right now about the dimensions because this is a simple tutorial. And then I'm also going to create a cylinder that we're going to subtract from the inside of our rectangle that will essentially allow us to have something like a channel going through our rectangle. So I'm going to move our cylinder into the interior of our rectangle. I'm going to do this using the move tool, which we also have already posted a tutorial on. And I've got my center select, so I'm going to select the center top of my cylinder and move it into the center top of my rectangle. There we go. I always go back to my pick tool so that I can pick off and make sure I've deselected any objects that were previously selected for my previous motions. And we're going to spin this about, and you can see because my cylinder was slightly longer than my rectangle, it sticks out a little bit at the bottom, but that's alright, because essentially after we use the difference tool, all that's going to be left is our elongated rectangle with a hole going through it, the shape and size of the cylinder. So our difference tool is over here under our modeling toolbar. It's actually down here under the modify section, and it's the third one over on the top called the difference tool. So we're going to click on that. First you click the shape that you want to take the difference from. This is the shape you want left behind at the end, so that's going to be our external rectangle. And then you select the shape that you want to take the difference of. That will be our internal cylinder. So I do that, and you can see it's completely gone away now. If we rotate this around, you can see that we essentially have created a hole running through the center of our shape. So that is what we call essentially making an internal feature in our object. Again, you can use this to make external features as well. If I make another cylinder, this time if we look at it from the top and we just move it so that it's overlapping one of the corners of our rectangle, and then back to our pick tool, click off so that nothing's selected. We go to our difference tool, again we select our rectangle, and then we select our cylinder, and now we've created a curve in the outside of the cylinder that's actually bending in towards the inside, essentially the opposite of a bevel or a rounding surface. It's concave inwards. And so essentially we've created a slightly more complex internal feature also using the difference tool. Now say we had created a somewhat more complicated shape on the inside than this simple cylinder, and we wanted to go in and take a look, make sure everything was positioned properly, and just essentially see what it looked like on the inside. We can insert what's called a clipping plane. So again, I'm going to go back to my pick tool, and then over here on the palette dock, one of the windows is entitled clipping planes. Now it's fairly close to the bottom, so depending on what other windows you have open, you might need to close them so that you can bring it up higher and be able to see it. But essentially I just select this little green plus that has new clipping plane, and you can change the name if you want. Right now I'm just going to leave it at its default of clipping plane 1, and it's inserted the shape into our work area. Now this is our clipping plane. There are 5 different arrows, one at each corner and one in the center, and you can select any one of those with the pick tool and essentially move the clipping plane back and forth across your work area. And you can see as I do it, it's showing me essentially a cutaway of my shape at all of the different points along what is right now our y-axis, because that is the orientation that we currently have the plane at. So I can see, and if I click again, I can stop it moving. I can see the internal cylinder running through our object. Now, as you might have seen me do a couple times, you can hover over the object, and you can still see an outline of the object as a whole. It doesn't actually go away. We've essentially just made part of it invisible for a little while. If you click on this eye right here, essentially the clipping plane becomes no longer visible. So if you wanted to render an image of just the internal features of your object, this would be the way to do it. If you wanted to export it, you could put in the clipping plane, make it no longer editable and also no longer visible, and then export that image. The circles at the different corners are general rotational axes. So what if instead of wanting to move this along our y-axis, I actually wanted to move it along our z-axis and to take a look at our sample up and down that way. So I can click this top one, and then I can rotate it 90 degrees, or there we go. And then now I can look up and down, I can look at the internal features of it along our z-axis instead of along the y-axis. So essentially I can take a look at this at a whole bunch of different ways, and it still allows me to view the internal and external features of our object. So things to consider as you're taking a difference from something. As you've seen right here today, I've only taken differences of shapes that have a contact to the outside. Here, I'm going to make it so that we can see our whole object again for a minute. So both the cylinder I subtracted from the center and the one on the outside, I haven't created a totally enclosed internal feature, and there are reasons why sometimes that's not the best thing to do. When you're printing, especially if you're printing for stereolithography, the printer will want to add supports for totally internal features that if you don't have a connection to the outside, or if perhaps it's not an easily accessible connection to the interior, you might not be able to remove those supports very easily. There are also potential printing problems such as cupping and creating a suction on the base that internal supports can have depending on their orientation. So it does do good to be careful and potentially, when you can, have those internal features have an exit to the outside of your object. The other thing too with a totally internal feature is that as printing, especially again with stereolithography, is continuing, resin that has been uncured can get trapped inside that internal feature, and then as you go through the post-printing processing and the post-cure, that resin can then be cured, and so what you thought would be a hollow internal feature can end up being still solid and filled with cured resin. So just things to keep in mind as you're designing your objects and your shapes for whatever purposes you have for them, that having totally internal features can be difficult to work with and backfire. But it's also something that gives us a greater diversity of the objects that we can create when we can have internal features in general. So it's up to you to balance what your goals are for your object along with printing capabilities. So thank you for joining us today.